All right. Are you seeing my inclusion, collaboration, and agility in the workplace title slide?
Yes, perfectly well, clear, and etc. So that is fine. And brilliant. So I'll be recording like as I said, and yeah, that would be.
Sounds good.
Yes,
So
yes.
what's going on there in Chile? Are you in lockdown or are you free to move around?
We are just starting to get released. Like it hasn't been long. Like I think maybe last week my area got a little bit more released, but then since a month or more, or a month and a half, maybe not a month, I think it's been going down. Like we've been unlocked a little bit, bits by bits, but it was a long one. Like we were since March till September.
Yes. Yes. And you know what's happening, you've probably seen on the news what's happening here in the US, that many of the US states freed up mobility, businesses opened, and now they're having to close. So it's that sort of, you're free, you're not free, you're free, you're not free.
Yeah.
But I will say California has been a lot more conservative than some of the other states in terms of the freedom and mobility, and our kids are still learning at home. They're not at school yet. And I think it's just our governor and the state of California has been super cautious about not wanting, a backlash. So we're actually glad about that here in California, but I know elsewhere in the US, people were just like chomping at the bit to get out and, go to the bars and go to the restaurants. And yeah, it's not good.
Yeah, and it's been like kind of back and forth, which is so, I don't know, it's more uncertainty than, that knowing that you're locked down at least.
That's right. That is so right. I'm going to adjust my camera here just a little bit.
Yeah.
See that I'm more
yeah. So I actually, Eric Schockman, I'm not sure, but I think he lives in California too, but he's not in Pepperdine. Anyway, he was telling us about like this much slower release in California, and it seems that you guys are doing way better. So,
I think so. There's pockets where we've only had just a couple of cases. We happen to live in a part of California, Southern California, about an hour outside of Los Angeles, where we've had very few cases. So we've been really thankful. A lot of it is based on density. So our county is, people live, we're right near ranches and farms. And so people are kind of spread out anyway. So with less population density, there's been a lot less contagion from the start, which is great. But yeah, Los Angeles County is in a little bit of a different situation. So it's a little more dense up there. And so they're still having quite a few cases.
Yeah. In here, like we're just coming out of winter, whereas you are going the way around. So I think our winter was the tough bit. But the thing is that probably it's really nice that the learning about how to deal with COVID has had a steep growth as well. So maybe your winter is not going to be that bad.
Yes. Yeah. I was amazed. I was reading a paper last night by a colleague in which he's examining loneliness during COVID. Yeah. And in his paper, he cited probably 30 papers that were all published in 2020 on COVID, and primarily because he's working in the psychological space, the various different psychological fallout that people are experiencing. And I was so amazed that we've accumulated that much knowledge and learning in such a short space. And so on that side of things, it's kind of validating to know, because, academics are always criticized for the lag of our knowledge based on, what's actually happening in the world. Like we're so late to the party. And yet there is actually quite a lot of research that's already been done on how to cope. And so I was actually glad to see that maybe we are catching up,
Yeah. And also like, well, for our area, like things won't be the same. Like, so it's actually quite interesting as well. There's plenty of work, like it's going to be so different, right?
That's right. Forever changed.
Dealing with change. Yeah. And yeah, so we're going to wait still like it's 10 minutes too. So we've got a little bit of time. And Chris, how is family? All good?
Oh, they're great. They're great. Yeah, I was going to warn everyone that you might hear some violin playing in the background, some chamber music, classical violin. Our son, Zach, at 14 years old, his first class of the day is orchestra. So yeah, so his orchestra class starts about the same time that this session is supposed to start.
And he's online as well?
That's right. That's right. So yeah, full time.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Hopefully it won't, be too distracting. It's beautiful. It's beautiful, classical music, but
yeah, no, it would be fine. We've all been adjusting and learning. This is a very funny time, like where it seems like we're far away. However, we are inviting many other people into our houses. Like that's very private and very close, but at the same time, it's far away. So I think it's been a fun play of interplaying between these two.
That's so true. Yeah, we're meeting more of people's families and their pets, and we're actually seeing their homes when they don't use the virtual background. Yeah, it's really interesting. And we at Pepperdine, I don't know if you've done this there where you are, but we're really making some efforts to make the most of, what's a really unfortunate, horrible situation, but by purposely bringing in family and pets into different, not every meeting, but, different venues. And we have a saying in our department that hug breaks are allowed, because some of our faculty have little kids running around, while they're trying to do meetings and teaching. And so sometimes the little ones, 2-3-year-old, they don't understand that this is, a meeting or whatever. So they might just pop in and give mom a hug or give dad a hug. And we say, that's allowed. Hug breaks are allowed.
Yeah, it's fun. I think it's creating it's been a push for all of us to kind of really rethink stuff. So yeah.
Do we really even need to be that formal in the workplace? Probably not.
Yeah.
Why not share more of ourselves with each other? I think there's a space for that. I really do.
Yeah, and I think it creates like as well more space for commonalities.
Yes.
Like you might be different cultures, different so many other things, but then you both have kids, and in a way you're sharing same issues, or you so whatever, different races, different countries, different areas, whatever it might be. And so it's a great piece for this inclusion, collaboration, and agility.
Yes, it is.
I'm looking forward to it. Chris, I still have in my mind that presentation with the kaleidoscope that you did, like.
Oh, right. Wow, that was a long time ago. That was almost 10 years ago.
Yes.
Scary.
Well, tell me about that. Like, I was
before you had kids. This is before your kids, right?
Yeah, before my kids. Yes. Oh. Ages ago.
Hello, Cristina. I am Hector.
Let me.
Hi, Hector. Good morning.
This is Hector Madrid. He's the president of the Society for Psychology and Organizational Behavior here in Chile, like the one that Hector, couple of other academics, and me, we founded maybe last year was, and the ones that we've been planning everything. So let me introduce you to Hector.
Yes, nice to meet you. Meet you, right?
Nice to meet you. And I would like to thank you for for talking with us, because we are a small society, but with an increasing number of people interested in this topic and the organizational psychology and behavior in our country. needs more people like you presenting novel ideas or cutting edge research. So I really appreciate you are willing to share with us your knowledge. So thank you, and I'm really sure we are going to enjoy the presentation.
Oh, thank you, Hector. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I really admire what you're doing. I know that Australia is not too far ahead of you, actually, in terms of establishing their society for organizational behavior. It's a new society there as well. And having just moved over from the US and having been a part of some of those early meetings of the Society of Organizational Behavior Australia, I can say it really served an important role in our professional lives and in our scholarship. So it's a worthwhile endeavor. It's really important to have these gatherings and the community that's created by, by these smaller professional associations. In fact, I think a lot of people would agree that you would rather attend a smaller conference or workshop or session with like-minded folks from your location than these giant conferences, right? Like the Academy of Management or other, American Psychological Association conference. And so there's certainly a role for this kind of event and gathering.
Yes.
Well, so I have to apologize myself because I have to leave early your presentation because I got another commitment, a teaching commitment. So I'm very sorry because I'm going to lose the half of the presentation.
We're going to be recording this though, so we will be able to hold the link.
That is fantastic. But if you don't see me in the presentation, it's not because I am not interested. It's because I have another commitment. So
okay,
my apologies.
Sometimes
I won't take it.
Yeah, and also like it's really actually cool because this is the first seminar that that we are organizing as SOCIPCO that is oriented not only to academic community, because we have done some smaller conferences oriented specifically to research and all that, but this is open. So we are welcoming today a lot of people that comes from the industry and that and who is interested in evidence-based management, so that they are hoping to include evidence and make decisions that we have a more robust background and that can help us critically think and make better decisions, I think. So we are quite excited about this.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. The two big professional associations that I belong to are the Academy of Management and then the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, which is a division of the American Psychological Association. And they couldn't contrast more in terms of their approach to practitioners and involvement at conferences. So at the Academy of Management, you'll be lucky to see 15 practitioners amongst 10,000 academics. It's really quite disturbing how few practitioners are attending those gatherings. And then PSYOP is completely different. I mean, about half the attendees at PSYOP are practitioners, and they're there to interact and learn, and it enriches both parties, right? It enriches the academic work as they move forward, but then it also, hopefully enriches the practice. So it's nice to see that right from the start, you are engaging with people in industry, and hopefully, you'll continue to keep that spirit, because I think that's really important. It's really important to keep us relevant, keep us on task, Otherwise we go off on these tangents and just sort of, study what we are interested in, but may not be.
No point of theory floating in the
That's
of like not being applied. All right, so I'm just because it's 12:05 almost, I'm gonna start introducing, making a quick introduction. First of all, welcome Cristina, and welcome everyone to this first webinar, part of the series that we are organizing. As I was just saying, this is the a first initiative that we've got as Society for Psychology and Organizational Behavior here in Chile, that is pointing towards towards strengthening the link between academia and practice. So Christina's presentation today has both objectives in mind. So how we develop knowledge, we build evidence, scientifically test ideas, beliefs, and etc. And we can come to conclusions that can inform our practice and management, like evidence-based management. So we are really happy to welcome each one of you, as well as Cristina, as Society for Psychology and Organizational Behavior. All right, and I'm gonna get now to introduce you to Cristina. She's a longtime friend now, Chris, can we say that? And yeah, she is currently the Dean's Distinguished Professor. I've got my notes here. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to look because there is too much in here. The Dean's Distinguished Professor of Management in the Gracidio School of Business in Pepperdine University. She's a fellow of the Academy of Management, the Academy of International Business, American Psychological Association, Academy of Social Sciences Australia, among many others, as well as editor in and has a very important role in the growth of the knowledge, the body of knowledge and development of theory and research in our area. She is also concerned and never forgets like the world impact of research and what we do. And that's why her research is often very strongly applied to practice. And this can be has resulted in many recognitions. So for example, she has received a few times the award for the 1% of the most impactful research in the world in the area of economic and business. So that means basically that she's among the 1% of researchers around the world that has been mostly cited, that her research has been really useful and impactful to both the growth of knowledge as well as practice. And that was the Thomson Reuters highly cited distinction. She actually has over 25,000 citations, if that is a number that is real. It's amazing. So for those of you who are not in academia. And well, she's the recipient of the 2019 Medal for Scholarly Contributions. And well, I could keep going and on with this amazing curriculum and how lucky we are to have her here. But I do need to say one of the most important of all is that she's a lovely and beautiful person. So we are really lucky to have her. She agreed like with no questions about doing this webinar for us. And yeah, we are really happy to welcome her. And yeah, the mic is yours.
Oh, thank you for that beautiful introduction, Elisa. I really appreciate that. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you virtually, if not in person. I would far rather be there with you in Chile. I wanted to start the talk today with a little bit of a caveat. I would liken this talk to going out for tapas. So when you go out for tapas, you try lots of different dishes and they're tasty and interesting. No one dish is going to be entirely satisfying, quite likely. But when you finish the meal and you step back, you feel very content and full and satisfied. So I'm going to be sharing with you lots of little tasty tidbits from a whole series of different projects. And any one of those may not be all that satisfying. You might wish that you could hear more. But hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll step back and you'll feel like, wow, okay, so that body of research is interesting and perhaps even applicable to some of the work that you're doing. So that's my caveat for today. I will tell you a little bit about my research area more generally and my approach to research, given this is your inaugural session. I thought that might be interesting to you. Well, I started this career with a whole host of different observations and questions, mainly from just traveling around the world. So I asked myself things like, why do different people value such distinct things at work? Do some people actually enjoy working in teams? Many people don't, right? Why do workplaces feel so unusual in other countries? How can workplaces be designed to fit the needs of workers? And would this process look different in other countries? Then over the ensuing 20 years, gosh, I can't believe it is actually 20 years now, I explored these questions in a series of research projects in companies all over the world in lots of different industries. So you're seeing here some of the companies that I worked with over time. And these questions were pertinent in many different settings and industries. Another way of thinking about my research, or characterizing my research, I should say, is that the common theme is collaboration across cultures. And what I endeavor to do is to develop theory and frameworks and tools that will encourage methods of working across multiple sites, typically sites in different geographic areas. This is a picture of how I envision my research domain. It's an intersection of social cognitive theory from psychology and a systems approach, looking at multiple different systems in the organization, as well as attention to process as it unfolds dynamically, and then always trying to be, anyway, mindful of the intercultural context. So I examine these collective cognitive processes in teams and how teams and collaborations acquire and make use of information. And when they do so, how does that result in integrated and flexible behavior? I like to think of research such as mine as connective tissue across different levels of analysis, cross-sectional and dynamic processes, engaging different disciplines. And I try to take great effort to transfer the knowledge between research and practice. You can also think of my research in terms of kind of three major buckets, if you will, or domains: leading technology-enabled collaboration, organizing structure for innovations, and then navigating the multicultural workforce. And within each of these domains, I try to secure some funding externally, get together different companies in terms of partnerships for the research, and then in terms of outcomes or outputs, some scientific research that's written up in academic publications, but also incorporating it into curriculum, as well as training and consulting. So this is a roadmap, if you will, of how I would typically approach a topic, and each of these pillars is characterized by these activities. All right, just for a little bit of audience engagement, I thought I would have you take a quiz. Don't get nervous. There won't be any grades or marks, but you might just want to pull out a piece of paper and a pencil, because I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I want you to jot down whether you think the answer is true or false to these statements. All right, here's the first question. True or false? Resolving conflict is most of the battle if everyone is simply respectful when using technology, we can be effective as a team. True or false? Let's jot down your answer. All right, second question. Select the right people, give them the right task and resources, and all will be well in cross-cultural collaboration. In other words, it's the who and the what that are most critical. You agree with that statement? True or false? All right, third question. Members of teams need face-to-face time. Whenever possible, bring people together in the same room for bonding. True or false? All right, That's the end of the quiz. I'll give you the answers. In fact, based on my research, all of these statements are false. Right? Well, the devil's in the details though, right? Because there are aspects of truth to some of those statements, but when all is said and done, I have evidence that suggests that none of them are entirely true. So let's talk about some of that evidence and how it might be applied in the workplace. This is research that essentially destabilizes the conventional wisdom and hopefully helps to build new theory. All right, so that first myth, resolving conflicts is most of the battle. If everyone is simply respectful when using technology, we can be effective as a team. Okay, the reality of it is, as revealed in my research with my colleague Jennifer Gibbs, is that even with respectful interaction, conflict is rife in technology-supported, geographically dispersed teams, but constructive debate can be very healthy. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that we have conflict. It can actually be healthy for teams. So how do we know this? How did we derive that finding? We had 2 different studies that we conducted, and they were involving complex innovation projects across international partners, consisted of 5 industries, a total of 16 organizations, 32 cities, 4 countries, and the industries were defense, aerospace, and telecommunications primarily. In this project, engineering project teams that were both geographically dispersed and nationally diverse. And in fact, what they were working on, if you're familiar with military defense innovation, this was at the start of the Joint Strike Fighter program, which is the state-of-the-art aircraft. And the contract that was at stake and during our process that was actually awarded was a $200 billion contract across countries, across companies to design and build this aircraft. So what did we do? Well, we conducted surveys. We conducted surveys at team formation, at the midpoint, and at the completion of the project. We included members on the project teams that were designing the aircraft, but then also what we were calling customers. They were inside the organizations, but they were downstream in the design process, and they would be receiving the designs of the engineers in order to actually build and manufacture the Joint Strike Fighter. And we recorded their teleconference meetings to examine the patterns of communication amongst the team members. So multiple sources of data and multiple types of respondents. And here's what we found. Some really interesting findings. In these project teams, intimacy actually increased at a faster rate when using technology than when face-to-face. And I will say that subsequent research over the last few years in the IT area has replicated this finding. Distributed collaborators often participate more equally than co-located ones. And keep in mind that this is across different countries. So we've got cultural diversity, we've got language diversity, and we found that the distributed collaborators were participating more equally. And finally, perceptions of closeness or proximity are more important in predicting outcomes than the objective amount of distance separating coworkers. So this was quite an early study in the stream of research on virtual collaboration. And there was a lot of concern about the actual spread across time zones, across miles that these coworkers were going to be collaborating. And we found that it didn't matter so much the objective distance or miles or kilometers, but it was actually the individual's perceptions of the degree to which they were close, psychologically close to each other that drove the findings. So we zeroed in on a concept called psychologically safe communication climate. And this is an atmosphere within a team that's characterized by open and supportive communication, but also speaking up and risk-taking. And so that's where we see the constructive, healthy debate occurring in these teams. And here's one of the findings. What you're seeing here is that if there is a psychologically safe communication climate, then virtuality actually contributed to innovation. But in the absence of that psychologically safe communication climate, innovation declined as virtuality increased. And again, virtuality was the combination of reliance on technology, geographic dispersion, and the diversity, cultural diversity in the teams. So psychologically safe communication climate, a really central component to establishing an effective global virtual collaboration. And with our analysis of the team members' interactions, their communication within their teams over teleconferencing, we were able to unravel a process for establishing the psychologically safe communication climate. And it all started with initial risks or disclosures. So if an individual on the team provided input or an idea that was perhaps ambitious or maybe even conflictual in some way, how did people in the team respond to that disclosure or idea? If they responded in a defensive way that conveyed superiority or certainty or closed-mindedness, then we saw this cycle occurring: loss of trust, withdrawal, increasing division, increasing distrust, and producing what we would call a defensive climate. And then that defensive climate just created this negative spiral, negative series of events that continued to perpetuate itself in the team. On the other hand, if in the face of those risky ideas, those off-the-wall, unusual ideas, there was a supportive response that communicated a problem orientation, was spontaneous, candid, then we saw a cycle of empathy, willingness to continue to disclose, increasing openness, and the psychologically safe communication climate, which then fed a positive spiral, a positive cycle of supportive responses within the teams. So when we think about our interaction in our global virtual teams, it comes down to how are we responding to each other, in particular to those ideas that we may disagree with or that we may find to be particularly troubling or different or unusual. And that will create cycles of supportive or defensive responses. All right, move on to the second myth. Select the right people, give them the right task and resources, and all will be well in cross-cultural collaborations. The reality of this is that relationship development and intercultural competencies are equally as critical as the right people and the right task, and they will often mitigate personnel or task constraints. In other words, they can be all the more important, and they can be learned and they can be developed within the team. This is some work, ongoing work that I'm doing that investigates intercultural relationships in leadership development and community development. So the project involves a collaboration amongst academics, companies, and nonprofit organizations, as well as at-risk communities. The objectives of the overarching project are to progress future leaders beyond just simply being aware of cultural differences, to be able to incorporate their cultural awareness into decision-making and into their behavior within their collaborations. We also hope to be able to document these competencies, and we've done some of that already, and to complete project initiatives that are providing tangible benefits in the communities in which this work is taking place. The nonprofit organization that I worked with is called Jawun. They find skilled corporate volunteers and they connect them to at-risk communities to share knowledge and expertise. And Jawun is actually an Indigenous Australian word within the Kukubilanji language group for friend. The corporate secondis that participate in the Jawun partnerships actually physically move to the remote communities, and they spend 6 weeks in the remote communities. And the members of the communities agree to improve upon, develop their communities, utilizing the expertise from the corporate secondis. What's also important, which is not mentioned on the slide here, is that the community members themselves decide upon the initiatives. So it's not a case of corporates coming in and determining the work that's going to be done in the community. The community prioritizes their needs, decides what they need help with and how, and then Jawun matches corporate expertise to their needs. Up to this point, Jawun has placed almost 2,500 secondees. The partnerships are with very large, primarily Australian organizations at this point, but Jawun does have designs on moving internationally. They've supported 115 different remote communities, and their projects have been amazing. Educational programs, asset and income management, alcohol and drug use, health and well-being, after-school activities, everything, even including sports associations. So the design of this research also mixed methods. The first phase involved myself and my research associates spending time in the community. So here you see Doris. Doris has a small company that is involved in ecotourism on the land that her Indigenous language group has ownership rights to. And what you see her holding there is a survey that the corporate secondees helped her to develop to better understand customer service in her small tourism business. So this was a project that she initiated. She wanted help in understanding whether or not they were providing the customers what they needed and wanted in the travel services that they were providing. So we did some initial interviews, and we spent some time in the remote communities working with both the secondees and the Indigenous communities. In phase 2, we used a more sophisticated scientific approach, and that involved comparing training conditions. It's what's called a quasi-experimental design. Those of you with psychology background will recognize that terminology. And then we also spent time in the communities following the quasi-experiment to understand their experience of having the corporate participants in their communities. We used a different approach, as is often advocated for Indigenous research. It involved narrative storytelling, project evaluations, mainly orally as opposed to written, and then some performance evaluations that the community members provided for the corporate participants. So here's just a quick picture of what we did in the quasi-experiment. It was longitudinal, and it, as I mentioned, involved a variety of different types of data. So the key group that you see, the key training group, is that last group that spent 6 weeks in the communities, but we were comparing that group to those that participated in an intercultural project that only lasted 2 weeks, and then a classroom-only condition where they were just in the classroom, just hearing lectures. But all of the groups conducted a pre-test and a post-test of the same sets of skills. This is the kind of report that the corporate participants received initially, and then at the end of the secondment, you'll see a comparison. This is the one they received at the end of the secondment. It's a pre-post comparison. The orange bar is how they scored on these various different competencies prior to participating in the secondment, and the blue bar is how they scored after participating in the secondment. And you'll notice that some of the largest growth is occurring in skill areas that previous psychological research would suggest are personality traits that are not malleable, that are stable throughout one's life. So what we're demonstrating here is that an experience like this, where an individual is taken out of their normal environment and is placed in a very new, very different, very foreign environment, can in fact produce growth and change on some of these characteristics that we thought previously would not change. This kind of a shock to the system enabled them, for example, to be a lot more tolerant of ambiguity. We also saw some pretty impressive growth in domains that the secondees themselves targeted. So this particular person X, the secondee really hoped to improve upon their ability to engage interpersonally. And so we had them, the secondees, select a couple of areas that they would focus on. This was this person's focal area. And in fact, we saw some massive improvement here. Even small shifts in these skills are statistically significant, but you see a huge shift here in interpersonal engagement for this person. So we found differences across individuals in terms of inquisitiveness and interpersonal engagement in particular. Those were two areas where there were massive growth. We saw that for many subdimensions of competencies, that individuals that started at the same point would realize greater growth by participating in the 6-week secondment. So here you see a comparison, all of them starting out at 3.75 on interest flexibility, and as a result of participating in the Jawin secondment, far more interest flexibility gains than in the other two exercises. And unfortunately, if you look at that green line, that's typically what we do in a university environment, isn't it? Classroom only, unfortunately, not a whole lot of growth, despite our best efforts to explain the importance of these competencies and lecture and provide some experiences in the classroom. No growth there in that group. We did some more sophisticated modeling. Here you see a path model. And what this highlights is that self-confidence, social flexibility, and inquisitiveness are all of these competencies that we were targeting, but the way in which they're influencing thriving at work is through a behavior. And the behavior that we targeted here was intercultural bridging. So this is the ability to bridge across different cultures within a collaboration and ensure that everyone is understanding each other, taking each other's perspectives, on the same page, if you will, during the project. So it's not necessarily the competencies per se, you need those in the model, but it's the bridging that results from the competencies that will enable humans to thrive in these multicultural collaborations. So we had some lovely reflections from the participants. This is from, again, the leader's perspective, the secondees coming in and working with the communities. Having feedback in the debrief session and the surveys was really powerful. It was a this is it moment. It put me in a space of being able to contemplate where I was. The timing was spot on. Combination proved to be the most powerful personal development experience I've had ever in my life. So thank you. Someone else said, cultural competency program helps focus attention on broad issues of attitude and perception, and it'll impact your ability to establish relationships. I think this was vital to avoid at best wasting time and at worst causing conflict through misunderstanding. And again, someone else saying, very powerful experience. I will now be a little more confident in interacting with local communities. In other words, interacting with people who are very culturally different than myself. Before, I was just an observer, but now I'll be more prepared to go in and start a conversation, and I want to have a better understanding. So it was really critical to the success of this leadership development program that individuals spent time in the community developing those intercultural skills. And then I would add that when they went back into their corporate environment, we had some follow-up research that determined that they were, in fact, utilizing those competencies and those skills as they participated in virtual global collaborations around the world. So an example, we had secondees from Woodside Oil and Gas Company, and they do business all over the Pacific and all over Asia, both North Asia, South Asia. And so in the past, they had had difficulty with the cultural differences in their collaborations, most of which were virtual. However, having gone through a secondment program, even though they weren't seconding within Asia, they were seconding within indigenous communities in Australia, but that experience they were able to bring forward with them into their global virtual collaborations with their Japanese partners, with their Southeast Asian partners. Okay, so last myth. Members of teams need face-to-face time. Whenever possible, bring people together in the same room for bonding. Well, this has a lot of relevance today, doesn't it? Right? Because it's impossible. It's impossible. We're not able to bring people together in the same room. And in fact, even at the time that we collected this data, which was a few years ago, before the pandemic, before stay-at-home mandates, at that point, organizations often didn't have a choice, even then, of whether or not people were going to come together face-to-face. And so we set out to understand the implications of that. Is the strategic use of multiple communication technologies over time that results in effective teams? So what we found is that, in fact, it's often the case that global collaborations rely on a single technology. Email for everything, right? That's the go-to. Anymore, it's texting. Texting for everything. It's the be-all, end-all. But we know from prior research that at different points in a project, through a cycle of learning and knowledge management, there are different processes, right? And those processes require different kinds of technologies. So we asked the question, what if a team developed a strategic connection repertoire and they shifted technology in order to fit the learning processes that they were going through at any one point in time? So you can imagine when you're trying to generate ideas, acquire knowledge, that a different kind of technology, maybe one that focuses people's attention within a conference call, for example, would be particularly helpful. Knowledge integration, however, might require a completely different kind of technology. And then when it gets to implementing, when we want to implement that knowledge into decisions, into projects, into operational routines, yet again, different kind of technology might be needed. For example, a knowledge repository, or perhaps it's at that point where face-to-face communication is essential. So we set out to examine these issues in a multinational company, Alcoa. They have refining operations in 31 countries. We had a wonderful support from Australian Research Council linkage grants. I'm so thankful to the Australian Research Council for the funding. Here's a picture of the locations of the refineries. You'll see quite a few in South America. So I was fortunate enough to be able during this project to visit Brazil and Suriname. Didn't get to Jamaica, would have loved to have gone to Jamaica. But also spent some time in Spain and of course, Western Australia in the different refinery locations that Alcoa operates. This is a picture of what the collaborations look like. There was a member engaged in the same step of the refining process in each of the locations, and they formed the core. So for example, precipitation is one of the phases of refining for bauxite. So there was an expert on precipitation at the refinery in Western Australia. There was an expert on precipitation in Brazil. There was an expert on precipitation in Spain, expert on precipitation in North America. They formed the team. There was also a leader or facilitator, and there were external experts and sponsors outside the core that occasionally attended the meetings online of the core members. They had a variety of support tools. They had some collaboration tools, a repository, technical archive, and then they had an internal experts directory as well that helped support the work of these teams. In total, we were able to involve 50 global teams, about 450 people. And the objectives of the teams were to share knowledge in order to solve problems and to develop process innovations. They referred to this as transfer of best practice. And by best practice, what they meant was an operational procedure that is codified in a document in the knowledge repository that contains work instructions that standardizes how all personnel will interact with the process. Now, each of the refineries had their own set of best practices, and sometimes what was happening is they were engaging in the same mistakes, having the same kinds of limitations to their practices, and they had, prior to the formation of these teams, no knowledge of the problems and setbacks that they were all experiencing, many of which were common. So by coming together in these cross-refinery, cross-location teams, they were sharing knowledge about their best practices at each refinery in order to develop global best practices that helped to ensure that the same mistakes were not repeated time and time again across each of the refineries. So again, multi-phase design. I won't go through all the details, but you can see here that we worked with Alcoa for quite a number of years. Some of the work actually even predated my involvement in the project. And what I'm going to report today is actually some of the survey data which we collected between 2012 and 2014 in multiple waves. So in that phase, the interviews preceded our design of the survey and our pinpointing of certain issues within the survey. We also had access to their conference calls, which were incredibly helpful in context setting. And we analyzed those in another project that looked at participation rates in global virtual teams. And then, as I mentioned, the multi-wave surveys that were used to test our hypotheses quantitatively. I did get to attend a number of their face-to-face sessions and observe their interactions both locally in their own refineries, but also in the few face-to-face gatherings that they did have. Not all of the teams were able to have face-to-face gatherings, but some of them did. So we looked within teams at how they were developing over time, but we also looked between teams to understand the differences between teams. The within team analysis involved a graphic display of their scores at each time point based upon the survey data. And then in the between team analysis, we were able to look at a congruence of the technology and the task phase that the teams were in, with the working hypothesis being that if there was that congruence and if they were shifting over time, they would be more effective. We looked at a particular transition in the work of the teams that is critical, we came to understand, in terms of shifting technology. And that is when you're transitioning out of acquiring and accumulating knowledge and you're beginning to integrate that knowledge. That's a key juncture in these teams where they really do need to shift their technology use. Unfortunately, many of them didn't, and they suffered in their effectiveness as a result. So here's an example of the trajectory of a single team. Okay, this is an effective team. They were rated very high on a 10-point scale by an external global knowledge manager. And what you're seeing is how they engaged in each of the 3 stages of learning and which technologies they used at each time point. Now you recognize that at each time point, they were doing a little bit of everything, right? They were accumulating knowledge, integrating knowledge, implementing knowledge, and they were using a variety of different kinds of technologies. But we were looking at the most salient task that they were engaging in and the technology that they were using more so than other technologies to see if there was a fit. So this team at time 1 was engaging primarily in accumulation, a little bit of the other tasks, and they were primarily using an attention focusing technology. As they moved on to integration and then to implementation in phase 4, you see that gray line increasing. And at time 4, they were engaging primarily in implementation. And lo and behold, they were using public codification technology more so than the other technologies. And we extrapolate then that this was one of the reasons that they were highly effective, is they made these shifts in the extent to which they were using the technologies over time, and that corresponded to the tasks that they were engaging in. So as learning processes changed, the team engaged in these shifts, and those shifts are in line with our theory. All right, one other analysis here at the risk of overwhelming you with numbers. I promise I'll tell you the big picture takeaway. This was some sophisticated analysis that involves polynomial regression to look at the congruence of the particular stage that the teams are in and the technologies that they're using. So this is a response surface that we're plotting here. And the takeaway is that team effectiveness improves when teams are engaging in integration and they make use of the technologies which we refer to as sense-making technologies. Team effectiveness is at its worst when teams are engaging in that integration process, but they're not using the sense-making technologies. So this is just a numeric way of testing that hypothesis that we saw graphically depicted over time in the within team trajectories. And again, the big takeaway, teams were more effective when they exhibited a fit between their learning processes and their technology use, and they shifted that technology use over time. This project, it was a very long-term project, but it had a lot of impact, both on my own career and that of my colleagues who were participating, but also in terms of practice. The organization, and this is all reported within our final report, which was jointly produced by ourselves and our organizational partner, Alcoa. They claim significant leadership development and process improvement, amazing training programs that we were able to develop together collaboratively. We had an industry academic knowledge sharing forum with the company. They gained greater workforce engagement and team performance based upon our surveys. And the big impact that Alcoa was particularly happy with is they estimate about $100 million per year in operational savings due to the best practices that were generated by these teams, because these best practices had global applicability and they ensured that the operational practices were more efficient. So huge cost savings. Their return on investment in the project was tremendous, and the company was really, really happy with the outcome of the project. This is James Gray, our key contact in the organization, talking about the impact that this work had. Teams have developed. We had large gaps in understanding how teams should operate. We partnered with Cristina and her team to study our groups, but more importantly, to plan detailed interventions to improve performance. We were able to access the world-class knowledge, know-how, made a step change in team performance, and had a broader understanding of how to manage and benefit from the diversity inherent in the groups. And her work has improved our internal knowledge and left systems in place to ensure that the improvements are sustained. So beautiful testimonial from James. And there are a couple of reasons why I include this quote. One is that I understand we have representatives from industry in the audience, and welcoming researchers into your organizations and partnering with them to design the research can have multifold benefits for your organization. From the academic side, we're always looking for wonderful contexts within which to do our research. So we're seeking out those opportunities to improve practice and also gather the data that's necessary to develop our theories and test our theories. So when this partnership occurs and there's a deep relationship developed, it's a match made in heaven. The organizations benefit and the researchers benefit from the ability to test ideas in these contexts. All right, I think I will stop there, Alisa. I did have a couple slides on a center that I'm starting to develop, which I can talk about, but maybe we'll take questions first. And then if there are not enough questions to fill our time, I'm happy to tell you a little bit about ICA. But I'd love to entertain any questions that you might have, or comments, or at all about any of the research or issues that you're facing in your own research.
Mm-hmm. I would ask that if you have a question, maybe you can raise your hand so I can keep an order just in case. But in the meantime, maybe to start, I have two very simple questions that it might be due to my ignorance, really. Like, do you have can you give me an example of this attention focusing technology versus the sense making technology? Just I sort of
Sure. I glossed over that a little bit because it is a really interesting phenomenon that occurred in this organization. And we're actually writing about this right now because we think it's important to make note of it. We had anticipated that the teleconference meetings, which were really the primary way most of them communicated, would be the best place within which to do sense making, right? To integrate knowledge. It's real time. There's the opportunity to be spontaneous, to follow up with questions in the moment. Turns out, not so much. Not in the global virtual collaborations, where a good half of the participants were English as a second language, and yet English was the language being used in the collaborations online. So what we found is that the teleconferences were mainly used for focusing individuals' attention. They also used calendaring and agenda setting as an attention focusing mechanism. But in the conference calls, there wasn't a whole lot of spontaneous interaction going on. So that really wasn't where they were making sense of the knowledge. The sense making occurred in primarily text messaging. And as we talked with participants about why that was the case, also in email to some extent, but a lot of it was during text messaging. They explain that, yes, spontaneity is great, but oftentimes, particularly the Aussies, and Lisa, you'll appreciate this, accents very thick, lots of colloquialisms, right? Very difficult for the non-Australians, even Americans had difficulty understanding some of what was being delivered by the Aussies in the telecons. So through text messaging and emails, the non-English speaking participants were able to pause and make sense of what was being communicated and then communicate back. So there was some real-time exchange, but with a slight delay, right? And just enough delay that there was sense-making occurring. And through a dyadic iteration back and forth on a text message, a group text message, or a group email, they could nut out and make sense of the ideas, more so than they could in that moment on the telecon. So what that says to me and the other researchers, and again, we vetted this with the participants, is that having that little bit of delay and, even on a Zoom call or on a telecon, allowing for moments of silence, demonstrate that right now, allowing for those moments of pause can help ensure that everybody's on the same page, can help people catch up with the fast pace of the English-speaking partners, can help you identify colloquialisms, words that have been spoken with really strong accents. And that was very beneficial to the sense-making process. So just to sum, the attention-focusing technologies in these teams were the teleconferences, and sometimes they use video conferences, but this was pre-Zoom era, so they didn't use video conferences as much as we do now. I would assume that the same would be true in the Zoom calls today, though. And the calendaring and agenda setting, those were the attention focusing technologies. The iterative sense-making technologies were email and text messaging. And if you know the information systems literature, there is this notion of technology affordances, that there are features of technology that are objective, and then there are the ways in which the technology are used in practice. And so it's very important to understand the context and understand how the technologies are being used, because they may be being used in a way that you wouldn't assume based upon the objective features of the technology. So another example that is very current today is the use of the chat function in Zoom, right? So equally as helpful as text messaging would be after a telecon or after a Zoom call, using the chat function within the meeting. Some people are very artful at that. Other people are still trying to catch up. How am I going to use this chat function? But using the chat function can allow non-English speakers, or even those that are just not familiar with colloquialisms that are being used, to make sense of that information, right? They can ask questions of each other without disturbing the speaker. They can ask questions of the speaker, which perhaps the speaker will have time to get back to, maybe not always, but sometimes we do. And that can enable some sense making to occur in the moment that maybe wouldn't otherwise occur if it was just an oral exchange, spontaneous oral exchange in the context of the meeting.
That's really, really, really interesting. So actually the keeping in mind that Zoom and the meeting, the catching up, the chronic bit helps more the focus rather than actually the give space to the thinking, which is makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
I have another question that a colleague of mine was talking about, but I will give space first to other questions. So just turn on your mic if you like.
I don't know if we have chat going. It looks like we do have some chat going. Let's see if anybody asked a question in chat. I've just opened chat and I'm looking at my chat. So we had some people answering the quiz, which is great in the chat. Yeah. Oh, great. So Carolina says, this makes a lot of sense for me. I worked in a multinational with teams in Toronto, where I was, Dublin, San Francisco, Manila, Budapest, and I feel this explanation fits well with my experience. That's good to hear. That's good to hear.
And in terms of the current situation, like the pandemic and what we were talking at the beginning, like we mentioned at the beginning, work is not going to be the same. We all have been working from home, we all have had to develop experience in meetings online and etc. I think it kind of, there are so many questions that emerge and that your knowledge can help us eliminate. But one of our colleagues in the area the other day was asking, what do you think would do like this virtuality and globality of work to the culture, to the organizational culture?
That's a great question. And, you know, I saw just the other day, University of California at Berkeley, through Jenny Chapman, Professor Jenny Chapman, who's done a lot of work on organizational culture, as you probably know. They have a whole center for organizational culture. And just the other day, I saw an announcement that they were addressing this very issue in a workshop. I believe it's already happened, but I think they recorded it. And so you could go online to the Berkeley Culture Center and take a look at what some of the top Silicon Valley companies are doing in this space to address this very issue. My personal sense, having interacted with organizations here in the US and in my own organization, Pepperdine University, actually suggests that there are going to be some changes for the better. There may be a loosening, if you will, of the cohesiveness of the culture. So Michelle Gaffand, a colleague of mine at Maryland, has this notion of tight versus loose cultures. And so it may very well be that organizations that had tight cultures where there was lots of internal consistency as to what the culture represents are now seeing a little more looseness being developed because people are not at the organization site physically, you know, every day, or maybe not at all, right? But so that might be the downside. The upside, and this is what gives me some hope and some optimism, is, and mentioned this a little bit, Lisa, when we were just chatting, is that I'm seeing organizations being a lot more compassionate. I'm seeing organizations bringing together a work family in a way that they perhaps didn't consider, or maybe even didn't tolerate, explicitly didn't tolerate in the past. And so it could very likely be that our work-life balance and our well-being at work increases pretty dramatically, even if there's a little bit of erosion of the cohesiveness of the culture. You know, personally, I'm willing to sacrifice that because I think it's so important, and perhaps even more important, that we feel like whole people in the workplace, that we're able to incorporate all aspects of who we are: mom, you know, grandparent, sister, brother, etc., community advocate, you know, all the various different affiliations that we have, identity groups that we have, that we're able to express that in the workplace. And I'm seeing so much more of that, given we're working from home and we're bringing people into our homes with our virtual technology. So that's my optimism. You know, maybe I'm just too much of an optimist. I don't know. But I don't see a whole lot of really harmful downsides to a slight loosening of that consistency in organizational culture.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Lorena has her hand raised, so maybe
Sure.
that one, and then Eduardo's.
Hi, Lorena.
Hi, Cristina. Well, I remember you from UC Irvine. I was doing my sabbatical there at some point, and there were so many Christina, Kirsten, and another. There were like 3 of them, all of them great. And I mean, I know your work has been very influential for many of us. And I remember this one presentation that you made at one of the meetings, and you talked about this type of team that it's time constrained, and you followed up people. I think it was Hollywood, like this teams that get together to film. To film basically. So I am very curious if you have any ideas of what is going to happen to creators and during this pandemic, because they do need to be together to create, to film, just to interaction. So I am worried. I like movies and series, but so I'm wondering if you follow that up and you have any ideas of how technology may interact in the way that they can, if they can do anything about this issues.
Sure.
And just following on the issue that Cristina, this is my second question. The point that Elisa brought up about the organizational culture and the issue, I see a lot of issues with our students that the way that they make sense of technology is really impacting their performance. Like they see natural to cheat, like much natural to cheat than previously. For instance, the use of, yeah, sure, I only asked how to do it. I didn't ask for the question. So all these, there are a lot of issues that are coming up, but anyway, I'll focus just on those.
On those 2. Yeah, 2 very, very good questions.
2 issues, the creators and the tightness, looseness of the norm.
Yeah, in the movie industry, what we're seeing is some amazing collaborations that are taking place through technology. So editing capacity has just tremendously developed over time. And so you can, in fact, film independently in multiple locations and edit those, splice those images together in ways now that, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to do. So we're seeing filmmakers filming, perhaps with a small group of actors or one actor for that matter, and then splicing together creatively the various scenes that they're filming. An analogy to this, which is kind of funny, because I was telling Lisa that my 14-year-old son is in orchestra class right now online in the room next door. And I said, you might hear a little bit of classical music coming through from my son. Well, imagine an orchestra instructor, right? It's the same situation. You've got musicians in each of their separate locations and having to bring together, their beautiful sections within a piece. And so they're being very creative in their online instruction. They're using technologies like Flipgrid, for example, which allows the splicing and editing of audio material. They are doing some face-to-face practices, but they're using physical distancing in order to do that. And so, I think there are ways around it. I think that, and I'm not an expert on the film industry, but I do see that content is being created and that tech-savvy editors are able to overcome some of the challenges that you would normally find on set. It'll be really interesting, though, I think, to see if the nature of the final product changes, right? I mean, you can imagine that without an entire lighting crew and, multiple cameras and et cetera, that we might see a return to some interesting film techniques that we haven't used for a while, right? That are maybe a little less, a little less sophisticated if we're, involving live actors. So much of our work nowadays in film is animated anyway, and CG. So that hasn't slowed down. To your second question about online behavior, and the anonymity that we can sometimes have online, and does that lead to noxious behavior, dysfunctional behavior, right? There are instances where it does, and I've seen some research that are trying to explore the parameters, the boundaries, the conditions that are created, perhaps even unintentionally, that encourage the dysfunctional behavior as opposed to more functional behavior. From what I see, it does seem to boil down to ensuring that people do have presence, right? They do have a personal presence in the online environment. Very difficult with large groups, admittedly. However, with smaller classes, 20, 30, 40 people, techniques like simply everybody has to have their camera on, starting the session with a personal check-in. These things take time. These things may take even investments in, cameras and other technologies, but that can help overcome some of that anonymity that people feel. I also have seen research that suggests it helps to overcome the loneliness and the isolation that people are feeling. It's not a probably entirely satisfying answer to your question, but I think there's some ways that we're going to develop workarounds. Again, maybe I'm just an eternal optimist, but.
Yeah, and I think it would be, that's a comment on Lorena's. I think it would also start enhancing or potentiating our role on focusing on the motivation to learn rather than just the performance, because if it is that, then why do you need to cheat or that stuff? I think that might help, that's really cool. Eduardo had a question in there, I don't know if you want to read it, Eduardo. And Eduardo, he works with me, he's the head of area as well, so I introduce you. Christina.
Hello.
Cristina, how are you? My question is basically the same that we have here. That's based on your research and experience. Do you think that innovation in teams is more difficult in a context in where you have only the virtual interactions? Many companies are going that way, not only in the quarantine context, but right now. And I have only the impression, I have no research to back up that assertion. I think that resolving little problems is fine, but when we have to solve a more complex problem, then I feel like we're rusty, it's more difficult, the ideas are not so, they don't come up so easily. I don't know, that's my impression. Do you have previous research showing that the only virtual interaction decreases problems, more innovative problem solving, for instance?
Yeah, great question, Eduardo. Going back to, I don't know if I want to take time to actually flip back to the slide, but that initial study that I did with the Joint Strike Fighter teams, they were entirely virtual. They never came together face-to-face. That was not part of the design. And so team members were located in several locations in the US, in London, in Finland, and there were some Japanese members as well. So they were geographically dispersed and they were communicating entirely over their technology. And so were they innovative? Absolutely. And especially when they developed that communication climate that enabled them to really openly communicate the crazy ideas, right? To take those risks of disclosing. Was it more difficult to combine the information? They had amazing technology even back then. I mean, this was almost well, 15 years ago. Now I'm really dating myself, but even 15 years ago, they had some amazing collaborative tools that they were using in the design field, where they were sharing screens and they were all working together, within CAD and within other, Metaphase, I think, was one of the design tools that they used. And so they overcame a lot of the technical glitches, if you will. The interpersonal issues had to be addressed. And when they were, those teams were actually more innovative than other teams that we had in the comparison sample that, did not have as much virtuality. In other words, they did come together occasionally face-to-face. So that communication climate was really critical. And I guess that's a long-winded answer to your question. Yes, I do think innovation can occur. And as long as we've got that technology in place and we've got that, that communication climate, we may even be better off. We may even find greater innovation than we would when teams are constantly meeting face-to-face.
Thank you for that, Chris. Carolina Viles has also a question. So do you want to say it yourself, Carolina, or you want me to read that? I do not have a good connection here. Okay, so I will read it for you. All that sounds great, but I feel here in Chile, we are very far from it. What I've seen since I'm back in Chile is that there is a huge distrust from leaders to their teams. I have seen people overworking now because their bosses do not trust them and requesting them to do more tasks than in a pre-pandemic situations. How to address this and what to do to change it? How to create leadership that we can trust, but that will also trust on us. I do not have, sorry.
Yeah, she was just saying she didn't have good connection. Oh, that is such a great question or series of questions, and so difficult to navigate these issues of trust online. Now, we do know at a basic level that trust can be built online. That was some of the very early research on virtual teams looked at the building of trust online. And the studies that I was sharing with you today, there was a basic level of trust in each of those teams. Interestingly enough, in the Administrative Science Quarterly piece, where we looked at the communication climate, we did a little bit of robustness test, an alternative explanation by pulling out our measure for communication climate and replacing it with trust to see if we saw the same, drastic differences. We didn't. So it was more important that the communication climate was there rather than this interpersonal sense of trust. Now, at a fundamental level, I think both are necessary and critical. And certainly leadership trust in employees is critical. But I bring that up because communication climate is so critical in the establishment of trust, and the ability and willingness of employees to voice and to speak up when they are being overworked, when they're burning out, when they sense a lack of autonomy that they desire. This voice is so critical to success today. And it's a leap of faith, isn't it, on the part of the leader? I mean, I lead research teams, I lead and supervise research assistants and postdoctoral fellows, and you give people tasks and you're hoping they're working on it. To what extent they're actually working the hours that they report, we don't have as good a sense of that in the virtual environment. So yes, there is some trust involved. What I've done in my own work, and I've seen many leaders and organizations doing, is just really opening up that communication channel. If I had doubts about my RAs or my postdocs, are you putting in the hours that you should be? Talk with them about it. Openly talk with them about it. If they're feeling as though I'm micromanaging or I'm not allowing them the autonomy that they need, I'm encouraging them to let me know. And I see in my own organization and I see in other organizations that helps. Is it a panacea? No, but that open communication climate can help to further establish an environment where people are, feeling engaged and feeling as though if their needs are not being met, they can voice that, or if they're feeling overworked or they're feeling like they're burning out, they can voice that. I'm sure each of us are feeling the same way, right? I mean, the day is never ending when you've got your computer right next to you in your bedroom. You see it as soon as you wake up and your colleagues are only a click away, right? And so that's a good thing, but it's also not such a good thing. So it's very tempting to just, I'll just work another hour, or, I'll do a little bit of work over breakfast when you would normally perhaps be spending time with your family or your pet or outside taking a walk. Or so these are real challenges in the pandemic, and but I do think that we can solve them. We can solve them together. It's really, really important that it's a collaborative approach.
And I'm sorry, I'm again gonna put in my somebody else has a question that would like to a comment. Oh, the silence, I need to work on that. Okay.
It's okay. Silence is okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to say a little bit like following on that. I think there has been a really cool shifting, like following about the culture. Our conversation, because I'm taking it as a conversation, is making me think about different elements, like this changing of the artifacts that are part of our culture. So now maybe the office, and whether it is in the individual or kind of team and open or closed, that makes such a big difference when we have like the physical face-to-face work, maybe start being such a big issue. Like it would be rather like the setting, the commitment and the communication, and actually like the exact issue that Carolina was talking about, like issues like what sort of questions, what sort of knowledge, how willing are you as a leader and as a part of a team to put out your concerns, your worries, your weaknesses, together with your strengths. So I think that is going to be something really cool, because it is critical, as you say, to build trust. Because
absolutely, yeah, and the sharing of our personal selves at the workplace also helps to build trust, because as you were saying earlier, you discover that there's so much in common that you have with your colleagues, and that you might be, having the same sort of trials and tribulations, whether that be in your personal life or your work life or the areas in which they intersect. And so that kind of allowing time for that kind of sharing is really important. And, we delivered that message to the companies in the aerospace industry, to Alcoa, to all the companies that we've worked with, and this is pre-pandemic, how important it was to allow for a little bit of personal sharing. And some of the teams embraced that and others didn't. And so now I think it's just exacerbated that need, right? We really do need to understand the personal situations that people are in. And, on the one hand, like, I'll just give you a sense. In our classes, I teach executive doctoral students, executive DBAs. And in our classes, we start the first couple of minutes with a centering exercise where we just sort of have some silence together and a little bit of meditation, or however you want to use that time to just kind of center yourself. But then we also share for a few minutes about what's going on in our lives. And for many people around the US, they're dealing with COVID directly. They may have it themselves. They may have tested positive. Somebody they love may have recently tested positive. Many students are unfortunately losing people in their, personal circle. And they share a little bit about that. And you might think, well, gosh, how many times do you want to talk about that subject in a class? And isn't that taking up time, that you would be spending on curriculum? But it's so essential. It's so essential. And it builds that environment where even on subjects completely unrelated to COVID, people are more willing to disclose and to talk about risky ideas and to share what's on their mind and their perspectives. And that's enriching in the classroom environment, and it's also enriching in the corporate environment, right? So I think it's time well spent. The feedback I've been getting is that it's time well spent. So, you know, we've been preaching this for many years, that it's important to do that. And I think now we're taking that even to another level, and sharing sometimes what are, you know, really deeply troubling and personal experiences with COVID itself.
Yeah. In a training, in a leadership training that I do, like one of the big issues, like with this inclusion or diversity appreciation, has to do with this capacity to become vulnerable and to find and have a purposeful effort to identify what are our common spaces, like what do we share that allows us to kind of anchor together and identify our common goal as common and reach with our differences. You know, like we will be different, and we're creating groups that one might be an engineer and a lawyer and a teacher or whatever. So we're highlighting the differences. So we need to also kind of reinforce, like, where are we sharing? And many times are in these sort of out of work spaces that might allow, because this trust, like the cognitive bit, but also the affective bit, like the affective is really powerful, but it's very hard to build. So I think it's cool. Like, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. You know, a very wise social psychologist, Marilyn Brewer, developed a theory that actually explains some of what we're talking about here, optimal distinctiveness theory. And she's suggested, and a lot of her research over the course of her career bears this out empirically, that all of us have this need to belong, but also feel unique, right? And we want to express that uniqueness, but we also want to feel that we're part of a community or a collective, that it's not just I, but it's we. So it's that kind of balance between the two. Now, cross-cultural psychologists would say that across cultures, people have differing levels of need for each of those, right? So, you know, maybe in the US, people really want to be unique. And yeah, they want to belong, but they really want to be unique. And, you know, maybe in other parts of the world, it's more of an emphasis on the belonging. But at the heart of it, there is this sense that we all want a bit of both. And so, you know, maybe what we're seeing is that there's a new way of expressing the belonging, and that is it's a shared commiseration, or it's a shared experience of the pandemic, or it's a shared experience of what we're grappling with at home with our kids, or with, you know, with staying fit, right? We don't want our refrigerator to be our best friend. You know, maybe it's something of that nature that we're sharing to ensure that sense of belonging. And then once we have that foundation of belonging, then we feel very free to express our uniqueness and say, yeah, well, I disagree with that point. I actually see it this way. You know, my perspective is different. It's this. So, you know, I think she was very wise. That theory was developed, you know, probably 30 years ago, and I've used it a lot in explaining some of the phenomenon that I'm seeing in global collaborations. So it's kind of speaks to what we're talking about here too.
Yeah, agree. I know we've got some people from organizational world, and I was wondering if there is any comment or any question that is more applied and would be interesting for anyone that would like to comment or something.
We're losing folks. They're dropping like flies.
Yeah, it's time. Chris, maybe we need to close up, and we will put this later online, like Chris was okay to be recorded. So thank you very much. One thing that I'm interested is in here about your ICA.
Oh, sure. I'll just say a few words about it.
Especially for those academic, like, because it might be a really interesting topic. So
yes. So at Pepperdine, we're in the process of establishing more of a focus on research In the past, we've been very focused on outreach to industry, but also on the teaching portion of our mission. And so one of the ways in which we're increasing our research focus is through establishing centers or attempting to establishing centers. And one of the centers that I'm hoping to establish and in the process of trying to find some funding is this idea that I'm calling ICA. Now all of a sudden doesn't want to work. Okay, there we go. Center for Inclusion, Collaboration, and Agility. And so what is our mission? It's enhancing connections across cultures and locations and sectors with the goal of innovating. And, you know, there's a real need for this, and it's come from the highest sources that it's critical that we have the academic and business collaboration in order to have true impact on society. So we've got, you know, Francis Cordova, the previous director of the National Science Foundation, previous President Barack Obama talking to the National Academy of Sciences, and even, you know, Stephen Hawking talks about this need to adapt and change. So our purpose is to increase individual capabilities and capacity building, to understand the processes, and to further explore and also ensure that the technology interfaces are where they need to be to allow for innovation. And, you know, essentially my research would suggest that it's about the ability to share and surface expertise, to implement action plans, and then bridge these various boundaries that we have. I had a conversation with Beth Brodsky at Netflix, and, you know, she said the very biggest challenge that they're having is inclusion and agility. As more and more companies enter into the space of streaming content online, it's even more important at Netflix that they have inclusion and agility across their 115 different countries that they're involved in now. So the center would engage in research development, curriculum, academic and practitioner forums, and then communities of practice that involve participants from industry as well. And then within each of these areas, I have some information about, you know, what we might be doing. So within the research agenda, identifying strategies for improving collaborations, and then, you know, really broadly disseminating that information. Within curriculum enhancement, it's really about connecting scholars across the world and enabling them to bring the research into their classrooms, whether it be through case studies or through other content. The academic practitioner forums are really important in order to help bring these different voices to the table, different value systems, different disciplines. And then the communities of practice are about between academics, but also, as I mentioned, between academics and practitioners. And I think, you know, they're really essential for uplift within women and within underrepresented cultural and ethnic groups. And really at the heart of that is mentorship programming that we would hope to have. So that's, you know, my vision for what ICA might evolve. Now we have to get some funding before we can really get going. But, you know, hopefully within time, we will, Center for Inclusion, Collaboration, and Agility will come to fruition.
Yeah. Well, like personally, I think that sharing these spaces just can trigger somebody else's ideas, and maybe we all together can build magic things. Yes. So would you be interested in hearing from researchers here, ideas or anything?
Absolutely, I would. I am so interested in you know, the part of the world that you're located. I will say that of the various travels and research projects I've done, I haven't spent as much time in South America as I would really like. So maybe when travel loosens up,
we're gonna get you here as soon as we can.
I would love that. I would love that. Yeah, seeing Brazil and Suriname was not enough. I need to see the rest of the continent as well. Yeah. So that would be lovely. But, you know, until then, I would welcome any follow-up that anybody has, any questions or ideas that you want to bounce off. More than happy to talk about that.
Yeah, well, just a virtual thing. And thanks to all our participants. Now we have only few because it was mostly an hour plan, but really, really rich discussion. And we thank you so very much for this.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and good luck with your association. I'm really excited to see where it goes. I bet it's just going to grow and grow and grow, and pretty soon you'll be all across the Southern Hemisphere.
We just partner with the SOCIPCO, well, like not partner, but they are sort of like we are connected. So.
Good.
Yeah. So really cool. Thank you for all the participants. People is just saying their goodbyes and thank you. Like it's just a common feeling. So really, thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks. Have a great rest of your day. And I'll go see what my son is up to in his online learning.
All right. Take care.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.